Hello, everybody, and welcome to Psyched Out, a podcast focused on all things psychology, like psychological thrillers, unethical experiments, true crime cults, and more. I am your host, Emily, and for those who don't know, I have a bachelor's degree in forensic psychology and a background in law enforcement. This helps me provide unique insight on some of the world's most famous cases, movies, and events. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the I-45, a highway corridor that runs through Texas. This particular segment of road is responsible for approximately 34 murders, many of which remain unsolved. This is an investigative series that I am doing, and my hope is to draw new attention to the cases involved. If by some miracle we find something new, fantastic, but at the very least, I think it's important to remind the public about what's going on here and really push for justice on the I-45. Now, I will be honest, I have tried to record this like 4 times, and every time my dog has interrupted with his squeaky toys. So I apologize if he starts doing that. At this point, we're just going to get it done and hope for the best. So if you hear him hooting and hollering in the background, I apologize, but he only ever wants to do things while I am recording. Also, this episode's going to be quite short, which I apologize for, but you'll find out why, and it really has to do with the fact that there is scarcity of information pertaining to the cases involved in this. So understand that if there is more information to provide, I absolutely would do it, but I scoured the internet and came up pretty empty-handed. But without further ado, we're going to jump in. If you haven't listened to or watched last episode, episode 1, I highly recommend going to do that before you watch this one, because we'll make some different references and comparisons to these cases. So the chronological order goes Colette Anise Wilson and then Brenda K. Jones. So Brenda K. Jones was only 14 years old when she disappeared and was later found deceased, which is why she's on this list, unfortunately. Brenda was last seen walking to the Galveston, Texas hospital to visit her aunt on July 1st, 1971. Her body was ultimately found on July 2nd in 1971, floating in a nearby Galveston Bay. The bay itself was located near a place called Pelican Island, which was close to Seawolf Park and, as you may have guessed, the I-45. Now, Brenda was born in Galveston on November 18th, 1956, to her mother, Evelyn Jones. Brenda had 5 siblings total, 3 sisters and 2 brothers. Her sisters were Lillian, Pearl, and Phyllis, while her brothers were Arthur and Jeremiah. What strikes me about this is that I also have 3 sisters and 2 brothers, so it hits a little close to home for me just because of that comparison. Frankly, I can't imagine losing one of my sisters or really any of my siblings. That would be very difficult to deal with, let alone as brutally as what happened to Brenda. But given the fact that I too have a big family, I know that she was loved dearly by her mother and her siblings. Your siblings are going to look after you, and they're going to love you and adore you in a family that big. So I can't imagine what their loss is, but I take comfort in knowing that she had a lot of love. Now, according to the Galveston Daily News, Brenda was found strangled, floating in the bay with her hands and feet bound. An additional source, the San Antonio Express, states that Brenda was also gagged. Unfortunately, that's about all of the information that I could find on Brenda. Now, Brenda is a person of color, and if I'm being honest, that's probably why there was so little information on her case compared to that of Colette and Gloria's cases, which is an outright shame, but we also have to keep in mind that racism was far more rampant back then than it is now. Like, don't get me wrong, racism is still very much an issue today, but I would argue that it was even worse back then. So if I'm able at any point to find new information on Brenda's case, as I work through all of this, I'll make sure to speak on it and update what I can. Frankly, I really wish that there was more to go off of for her case. The little info that we have is helpful, but it's very lackluster, and there just isn't really anything there. And there's not much I can do about it, unfortunately. After Brenda, we move on to a 2-part case with Rhonda Renee Johnson and Sharon Lynn Shaw. In short, Rhonda was 14 and Sharon, who was 13, they were out on a date, not a date, but out on a day together, or I guess you could say a date, and they disappeared in the area of Harris County, Texas. This actually took place on the afternoon of August 4th in 1971, so that same year where a lot of this really started kicking off. Both girls were last seen walking along Seawall Boulevard in Galveston near a local beach. And on January 3rd, 1972, two boys fishing in the Clear Lake area discovered what appeared to be a human skull floating in water. The boys stated they initially believed the skull was a sports ball, which I can't really blame them for that because it's not like you'd expect to find a human skull while you're fishing. Also, when you're just a little kid, it just doesn't really happen. It's not something your parents prepare you for. 6 weeks later, searchers discovered the rest of the body belonging to the skull. And during this search, investigators located the body of another girl in a nearby marsh near the lake. According to a coroner's inquest filed on February 17th in 1972, the skull found in the lake was determined by dental records to belong to Sharon. Additionally, a crucifix found wrapped around the jawbone of the skull was identified by Sharon's mother to have belonged to her daughter. The other body found in the marsh was then positively identified as Rhonda. Now, one thing that's very interesting so far is the involvement of water in these cases. While Colette and Gloria weren't found in water, they were found near a reservoir, which, in case you don't know, reservoirs typically have water in them. And I looked up this particular reservoir and it does contain water. Brenda was found floating in water, and both Rhonda and Sharon's bodies were found in bodies of water as well. And this similarity is something that sticks out, right? It's a pattern between all 5 cases, so we need to keep that in mind while we dive further into what's going on. No pun intended. Just keep the information in mind for now. We'll talk about it in a little bit. Now, the San Antonio Express states Sharon was found in a drainage ditch near the Manned Spacecraft Center, so more of a precise location. As mentioned earlier, the body was identified through dental records, as well as her mom, and confirmed to be Sharon. A cause of death was not initially disclosed. However, the Waco News Tribune made claims that Sharon and Rhonda were beaten to death. Michael Lloyd Self, a former volunteer fireman who was later employed as a gas station attendant, was convicted in the murder of Sharon Shaw by 11 men and 1 woman. This was a jury trial. Michael Lloyd was also charged with the murder of Rhonda Renee Johnson. My understanding is that he did not get convicted of that because they did not go to trial. The working theory is that Michael murdered both girls after he picked them up when they were hitchhiking. Michael signed a confession where he claimed to have beaten both girls to death, stripped them naked, and threw them in the bayou after Sharon rebuffed his sexual advances. As mentioned, Michael Lloyd was convicted for Sharon's death and ultimately sentenced to life in prison. He was imprisoned for nearly 17 years based on a self-confession when his case was looked at for possible police misconduct and throughout appeals, right? So like life sentences, death penalty cases, those typically have a lot of appeals associated with them. Michael had always alleged that he confessed due to police brutality and threats of death, which doesn't seem that implausible when we look at the time this took place, right? Michael specifically stated that the police chief, Don Morris, I think his full name is Donald Morris, struck him with a billy club. That would just be like a police nightstick. Nowadays they're called batons, but billy club, and pointed a pistol at his head, which, if true, would make just about anyone, in my opinion, sign a confession. And when asked why he admitted to the crimes if he was innocent, Michael stated, quote, "I was afraid he was crazy enough to kill me," end quote. Michael actually died in prison in the year 2000 from cancer. And unfortunately, we're at a bit of a dead end for available information on Rhonda and Sharon's cases as well. To say the lack of information is frustrating would honestly be an understatement, but I do want to analyze what we have and what we know so far. So I took the time to map out where all of the dump sites were located and where all of the alleged abduction sites were located. I'm going to try and switch screens here so you guys can see what it is that I did. So when we look right here, right, we have a big cluster down here at the bottom. This is like the Pelican Bay area. Some of the dots overlap just because of how many things happened there. The only dot that I did not plot was the bus stop that Colette was abducted from because I don't know the specific bus stop. But if I'm correct, it's somewhere in this area as well. So there should be another blue dot around here somewhere. So if you're on the YouTube side of things, you can look at this while I give you my spiel. So as you can see, there's a big cluster on the Pelican Island area. The abduction sites and dump sites are fairly close together there. It looks way closer together just because of how zoomed out the map is. Understand there's still a little bit of space, but I'm trying to encompass a very large area. And Like I said, I have not been able to plot a Dot and Colette's case just because I don't know exactly what bus stop she was abducted from. But again, it's in a similar area as Gloria's. So we have to look at the geographical data, right? We have very distinct locations and their associated dump sites. So we have that big cluster on the Pelican Island side. And then we have where Colette and Gloria were abducted towards the northwest side of things. And then we have a standalone dump site at the NASA Center that's roughly halfway between where the Addicks Reservoir is located and Pelican Island. So my speculation as of right now, and again, this is educated speculation, is that the unofficial operating area for the individual involved in this, assuming that it's only one killer, is that it's likely closer to the NASA Center than the other two locations because it would be halfway in either direction, right? Cuts off driving time, cuts off travel time, cuts off chances of being caught. Again, that's assuming it's only one person. But that's just kind of a working theory, right? When you think about it, it just makes a little bit of logical sense, if you will. Now, I will say that this can change as we dissect more cases and I plot more stuff on the map, but we do have to pay attention to geographical data because a lot of times that's important. So right now, that's what we have. That's what we're working with. As for the girls and the dumping locations, we have to go back to the water motif, right? Because that's very notable. What this does is it suggests that the person is familiar with the bodies of water. They may go to these locations regularly, meaning it wouldn't be out of place for them to be there, whether they're like fishing as a hobby or they work for Game and Fish or something along those lines. They're like maintenance along the waterways because it's just weird to know where all of these specific locations are and like have all of the bodies end up in bodies of water because if that wasn't intentional to a certain extent, you could just drop them off on the side of a roadway legitimately anywhere, right? Again, this is assuming it's one killer. On top of this, it may suggest a type of sophistication because it's common knowledge that investigators hate two things primarily when it comes to a crime scene, which is water and fire, because both are very good at rapidly destroying evidence. And in all 5 of the cases we've looked at, the bodies have been so decomposed, it's delayed identification. And that is in part due to the water and honestly nature as a whole. Now, as I mentioned, Colette and Gloria were found on land, but again, they were found beside a body of water. Brenda, Sharon, and Rhonda were all found in water. As for cause of death, we don't have a lot to rely on here because there's really not a lot of information pertaining even to Colette and Gloria's case, right? There was proof, in Gloria's case at least, that she had been beaten to death, specifically with trauma to the head. Investigators surmised that the same likely happened to Colette just because of where they were located, having been dumped basically side by side. Brenda was said to have been strangled to death. Again, that I don't know how accurate that is, but we're gonna assume that that's correct. And then we have Rhonda and Sharon's cause of death, which we can really only speculate on because, again, Michael Lloyd's confession, right? There was no actual forensic evidence to back this up. We'll get into that in a little bit. If you recall from episode 1, there was also mention of a noose or rope in relation to, hang on guys, I just realized I never put my camera back on. There you go, now you can see my beautiful face again. I hope you got a good look at that map. Anywho, there was also mention of a noose or rope in relation to Gloria. Again, mostly speculation. I couldn't find any other sources that corroborated that. It was just mentioned once. But I think we can say that if we operate under the assumption that one person is responsible for all of these, they were likely up close and personal, right? It's not like somebody just shot an individual from 30 feet away, right? This is all very hands-on, very intense, very close. But truthfully, we don't have a reliable way to analyze what the person's MO is for killing, again, assuming it's only one person. We also have to look at the fact that if Brenda was strangled, that's very different than blunt force trauma, even though some of the same principles still apply. But honestly, with how underreported these cases are, who knows what's accurate and what isn't. We also have to look at race in these things, which I know sounds bad, but most serial killers stay within racial lines. This is one of the very first things that my professors taught me. And so Brenda being a person of color when the other victims, to my knowledge, are white. This means that Brenda's death may not be attributed to the same person. Is it possible? Yes. Is it a guarantee? No. And this would also make sense if you look at the fact that there's a working theory. Everybody else except for Brenda was murdered by blunt force trauma, right? And she was the only one that was strangled. Some of you may be saying, well, Gloria seems like she would be Hispanic, and that's accurate, but race and ethnicity are very different, which is something that I didn't quite understand at the time. But if I were to take a police report, which I do, we have sections where we mark people's ethnicity and people's race, right? And if I'm writing down whether that's victim info or suspect info, I have to classify them. But if it's a Hispanic person, they are racially classified as white, but ethnically classified as Hispanic. So just kind of keep that in mind. There's a little bit of weird wiggle room there. So again, we have to look at the fact that there are some differences in the way Brenda's case is compared to the others. Really quick, I do want to go back to locations while I'm thinking about it, because I do think it's curious how Sharon and Rhonda's remains ultimately ended up in a drainage ditch. Because to me, this means like one of two things, right? The remains floated there naturally from some type of current after being dumped in a different location, or they were intentionally discarded there, right? So that may influence some of our geographical data. Now, if they were intentionally discarded there, that's a sign of major disrespect. It's a drainage ditch, right? It's like throwing garbage away, a very dismissive and distant gesture. It's also a much more public location than the Addicks Reservoir if we're looking at like the NASA Space Center, right? Big tourist attraction, which reminds me that when we look at the timeline of when each girl disappeared and when they were found, Brenda was found almost immediately. She was found way quicker than anybody else involved in these cases so far, which to a certain extent suggests just an overall lack of concealment, a lack of effort, which also hints to the fact that her death may not be tied directly to the others. As I've mentioned like 8,000 times, there's not a lot to work with for these three cases in particular. I am hoping to find more when I look at the other victims, but we'll honestly just have to see. It may be that there's really just no media out there. I think part of the reason there's a lack of media is because law enforcement was trying really hard to suppress the information. Again, speculation, I don't know for sure. But having so many girls get murdered so close together in such similar areas isn't a great look, and it would absolutely worry the public. So it would make sense for them to try and mitigate that type of information getting out when it would be detrimental to, honestly, a slew of things. So, that said, as much as I want to keep the focus on the victims, because that's really what it's all about, we actually have more information on Michael Lloyd than anyone else in these cases, which is a shame. And while I hate to spend time on him, I think analyzing him is important with the context of this case, and I do think that he also was a victim in this. So just please bear with me on this. I understand that, understand that if I could put my attention elsewhere, I would. I just don't really have that option, If I could, I would talk about what kind of sports the girls played, what their favorite school subject was, what they had for dinner, what their favorite, sibling inside joke is. Like, there's so much stuff that I would love to talk about, but I can't because that's not what gets reported in cases like this. And when you do get reports on cases like this, sometimes there's no information, which is an outright shame. So one piece of info I've held in my back pocket is that another investigator who worked at the same agency as Mr. Morris stated that he saw Morris treat another person during interrogation the same way that Michael Lloyd was allegedly treated. Now, keep in mind, at this time, Michael Lloyd was just a suspect, and I forgot to mention it, but the only reason he was a suspect is because somebody called in a tip and just said, hey, you should go look at this gas attendant. So there's really no reason for them to be treating him the way that they did. But the investigator's name was Dave Coburn, and he was very much like, yeah, no, I believe that this happened. There were some other people in the agency as well who believed that Morris 100% treated Michael Lloyd this way. Now, after handwriting an initial confession, Michael later adjusted his written confession with an updated oral version of events, and a lot of people speculate that this happened after Morris realized the initial confession did not corroborate with what little evidence they actually had. So much so that Michael originally stated he'd strangled Rhonda and Sharon when there was no proof of strangulation at all. Michael later retconned this and said he actually struck them over the head with a Coke bottle, which is almost more ridiculous to me because at least the strangulation would be like believable. I think it'd be very difficult to hit and kill two people with a Coke bottle. Like, hit them hard enough that you don't break the Coke bottle. Like, it's just weird. It's not plausible in my opinion, because realistically, as far as murder weapons go, it's not a great murder weapon. I mean, you probably would have had more success with a rock, right? Lloyd also stated that he threw their clothes on the highway after stripping both of the girls naked. However, reports indicate that Sharon and Rhonda's clothing was actually found in the area of their bodies. So again, another blatant contradiction. Now, as mentioned earlier, Michael did die in prison of cancer after exhausting all of his appeals. I don't have a lot to say one way or the other, but based on the information, do I think it's likely he was wrongfully convicted? I do. Do I think I would have felt comfortable convicting somebody based on the self-confession that had so many inconsistencies? I would have had a very difficult time with that. I think I would have had a very difficult time as a prosecutor taking that to court. Part of the reason I think that he got convicted the way that he did is because at that time there was far less understanding when it came to self-confessions and false confessions. People weren't as aware of those as they are now. So people very much had the mindset of like, well, why would you do that, right? We also have to acknowledge that in this time period, the pressure that police were under to bring someone to justice was massive, right? So they very well could have just been like, yeah, this is our guy, we're going to put him away, and dismissed a lot of instances where they should have been forced to second guess themselves. So it's unfortunate, right? Like, the mentality of, why would he falsely confess, etc. Like, we also have to acknowledge the fact that there were much less regulations on police back then than there are now. Everything is recorded these days in police work, which I think is okay. I've mentioned it before. I love my body camera. Anybody who says that they don't like the things being recorded or their body cameras they hate it because there's something that they're trying to hide, right? If I'm doing my job appropriately and I'm working within the extent of my job, I don't have anything to worry about. But it was a very different time back then, which I definitely think influenced this case as a whole. Now, very briefly, before we close out this episode, what I do want to talk about is how a false confession like this could have happened, for those who aren't necessarily as versed in that, right? So there's a lot of studies, a lot of documentation suggesting that some of the biggest issues when it comes to false confessions are, one, like insanely long interrogation times. I mean, we're talking like 12, 15-hour long interrogations, ridiculous amounts of time that, in my opinion, are borderline torture. Like, there's no reason for that unless it's the guys who did 9/11, right? No reason for that. On top of that, it's language that is used to lead a suspect, right? Instead of just asking, hey, tell me what happened, it's, well, the girls were strangled, you know that, right? And then if the suspect says yes, they're like, oh my God, we got him, guys, even though they led the witness or the suspect into that answer, right? Not appropriate. Another big point is education level, right? I don't know enough about Michael Lloyd, but considering that he was only a gas station worker, I would say he's probably not the most intelligent individual. That's not to say that all gas station workers suck, but like most people that are working at gas stations, it's not like their career goal, right? For some people it is, but the average person, it's not. And it's either a filler job, like you're in college and you're making money, or you're not qualified or educated enough to get a job outside of that, right? So there's a possibility that was played in there. Again, police brutality, police intimidation, very big factors in false confessions. So I think that given these circumstances, while we don't know a whole lot of what happened behind closed doors, I'm inclined to believe Michael when he says that there was some tomfoolery going on there. And I think that the police in this situation were in a hot fire hurry to get somebody responsible for these cases. And I think in the end, they did a very massive disservice to Brenda and Sharon and Rhonda. And I hope that they feel at least a little bit of guilt and remorse about that. They probably don't, because a lot of times in wrongful convictions, people who are responsible for those are not open or willing to admit that they've done wrong. Part of that is because they are just that ignorant. And then the other part is if they admit that they were wrong, that opens them up to lawsuits and things like that. It gets really messy and really complicated, like very, very fast. Um, but yeah, so unfortunately, not a whole lot to go on. I was really hoping that there would be more. So I will be keeping my eyes and ears open for any other information pertaining to Brenda, Rhonda, and Sharon's cases while I go through the timeline. Like I said, I'll be updating the map as I go. We'll be getting new geographical information, things like that. But I did do a little bit of profiling in this, and it'll be interesting to see how much of that holds up. So let me know your guys' thoughts, feelings, opinions down in the comments, things like that. Just a quick life update. So my brother is turning 17 next week. So I will be out of town, and there is a chance that I will not get an episode up. So I apologize in advance, but please understand that I am the only person who is here to research these and record these and everything like that, on top of working a normal job that is very stressful and very time consuming in my life. I need to prioritize and value my family as well, right? Because you never know what can happen. I mean, that's one thing that's very sobering about being a police officer as well as in the true crime world. Anything can happen. So make sure you guys tell your loved ones that you love them, take care of each other, and as always, stay psyched out.